Hi everyone, my name is Ali Mashadi. Thank you so much for purchasing this course, Polishing Your Work for Publication. So just a couple things about this talk. First and foremost, I want to make sure you understand that this presentation assumes that you've done some basic skill work, learning what makes a good story, a good memoir, a good self-help book, whatever it is that you're writing, because we're really talking about polishing your work for publication. So this is sort of a later stage in your revisions towards the end. And if you're close to submitting, you probably have a finished draft that you've already reworked a few times to make sure you're getting the plot to unfold right, the character development to be interesting, the general flow and structure to be strong. What I'm going to do is really tell you how to tighten it up and put those finishing touches on it. And I also have a list of resources and a handy checklist that goes along with this presentation, which you should be able to download there from your course dashboard. So make sure you check those out and grab them for your files. So first and foremost, I want to get us on the same page with a little bit of context. Why is it so crucial that your manuscript be perfectly polished before you send it out? Now, if you're self-publishing, the answer might seem obvious. Of course, there's nobody checking your work. You're the last stop, you're in control. So whatever you put out into the world needs to be professional, and you're the only one who's going to be responsible for that. But those of you who are submitting to agents with hopes of getting a book publishing deal, some of you may be wondering, well, why is this so important? I mean, how much work do I really have to do in making this manuscript perfect when it's going to go to a publisher and they're going to have an editor there who's editing, who might want more changes, who's going to work with me further on the draft, right? So the simple answer is, for all of you, you must polish your manuscript to make it the very best it possibly can be, because competition is very stiff and the book markets are overstuffed. Many of you may have heard this phrase or this idea that agents and editors are really just looking for reasons to say no. I want to dig into that a little bit because, you know, these industry professionals, they're not dream killers. Right? They didn't get into this business just to upset people and say no and stop them from getting through the gates, right? That's not what gatekeeper really means. The reason that agents and editors are quote unquote looking for reasons to say no is because they have to get through an incredible number of submissions on a regular basis. The sheer volume of submissions is just overwhelming. A company called Bowker, which many of you probably know, is the support company for the publishing industry. They create and manage the ISBN system. Bowker's reported that approximately 300,000 new titles from established publishers are coming out each year. Over the last few years, that's been fairly consistent. Now, the most optimistic estimates, you know, I've heard lots of numbers bandied about, but I like to try and be as optimistic as possible because you're going to see that this can be a little overwhelming. Let's say approximately 1 in every 100 manuscript submissions ends up getting published. Well, if we're talking about roughly 300,000 new books coming out every year, and only 1 in 100 manuscript submissions are getting published, by that math, we're saying that approximately 30 million manuscripts are rejected every single year. Okay, 30 million manuscripts. Those are coming in to agents and editors constantly. So you have to polish your manuscript because your book has to stand out amid all that noise. To complicate matters, editors are increasingly overworked and underpaid. There have been many years, the last several years, of downsizing, layoffs, even bankruptcies, publishing companies merging and splitting apart. And yet, most cases, the editors who are remaining still need to get through the same number or even an increasing number of submissions. So the book publishing industry might be shrinking or reorganizing and there's less manpower, and yet there aren't fewer people who want to publish a book. If anything, it's the opposite. More and more people constantly want to try and publish a book. Fewer editors are editing than ever before. Not because they just don't feel like it or because they're lazy, but because of this whole shift in the industry. So there's more of an emphasis on marketing books and positioning. There's an emphasis on acquiring more and more titles, especially bigger and more successful titles from authors who are already established. So what you end up having is an increasing number of books per editor, right? Fewer editors, more books, more marketing meetings, more emphasis on buying bigger and better books, more emphasis on all of the different things that happen around selling a book equals less time to actually edit. As a result, editors are looking for projects that are near publishable, works that don't really need a lot of input from them because they frankly just don't have the time to help get a draft that's almost there all the way there. And they can't take the risk that you're not going to be capable of getting it all the way there on your own. And because editors are looking for projects like that, agents are therefore in turn looking for projects like that because they know what they need to deliver in order to sell the project. Now, those of you who are going the indie route, you might be hearing all this and thinking, oh, that is why I am self-publishing. I don't even want to get involved in that nonsense. But I got to tell you, you guys don't have it much easier. You are up against approximately 400,000 self-published titles each year, and that number is rising. About 1 million books that are considered unclassified for various reasons. A lot of these are public domain works like classics that small publishing houses and independent publishers are bringing back in new editions because the rights are available. There's lots of different books that fall into that category, not to mention that in many cases, for example, Amazon does not require authors to assign an ISBN number to a Kindle ebook. So there's any given number of ebooks out there that don't even have ISBN numbers that Bowker isn't able to track, added to that number we've already mentioned, 1 million plus 400,000, and they're all the books that are already out there. There's the same number of books that were published last year, the same number of books that were published the year before that, and so on and so forth. So any way you slice it, if you are bringing a book to market today, you are facing incredibly stiff competition and a lot of marketplace noise, which means your book has to be the absolute best it can be to compete. So I'm going to walk you through a kind of checklist that you can practice using on your own manuscripts of nearly any type. Most of what I'm going to talk about applies to all kinds of books. In some cases, I might mention something that applies more to, say, fiction or memoir versus other types of nonfiction, but I'm going to point those out as we go along so it's clear. I have a suggestion for you. If you want to make this sort of interactive, you can pause your recording after each slide and review your draft for instances where you can identify that problem, and then go ahead and apply the suggested solutions. So you can sort of review all of this together and then use your handy checklist handout later as a way to walk through. Or you can just start and actually sort of work along with me and turn this class into a little bit more of an interactive workshop. Entirely up to you. First problem we're going to tackle, and by the way, these are in no particular order. It's just a collection of some of the most common issues that I've seen in my years working in the book publishing industry, almost 20 years now. One of those very common issues is unnatural dialogue or voice. Now, this is one of the most important things you can work on by reading your work out loud or having someone read it to you. This is a great way to catch this particular problem. All right. Now, in fiction, or even in memoir, the use is probably pretty obvious, right? You're talking about actual dialogue. For nonfiction, you might also be using dialogue. For example, when you relate an anecdote, or you're sharing client stories or stories from other people as part of your instruction, you might still have some dialogue, right? So the issue here is to resolve unnatural sounding dialogue or an unnatural sounding voice. Listen to how your dialogue sounds, right? That's where reading your work out loud, recording it, playing it back to yourself, or even having someone read it out loud to you can be really helpful because you're listening. Do people really talk that way? Do you really talk that way, right? Voice comes into play in terms of narrative voice, especially if you're writing nonfiction and you are the expert explaining something to your reader. Do you really talk that way? So we're talking about things like formal versus informal, right? Contractions are your friend. Many people have been taught over the years, especially early in grammar school, that you shouldn't use contractions, that contractions are somehow a lesser form of writing. And, you know, in some cases that can be true. For example, if you are writing for a university press, if you're doing academic work, you probably want a more formal voice. But for the vast majority of us writing commercial mainstream types of books, you generally want something that's a little more informal. Okay, so I just want you to listen to how these two examples of the sentences sound. One has contractions and one doesn't. I do not think there's anything wrong with her. I don't think there's anything wrong with her. Which one sounds more natural to you, right? Which one sounds more natural for your character or whoever's speaking, your narrator, right? That's what we're talking about here. So like I said, you know, does your character talk this way? Consider who your characters are. Speech is an expression of many things. So for example, if your character or whoever your speaker, your narrator is educated versus uneducated, from an urban area versus a more rural area, there might be regional accents or phrasing. Is your character, is your narrator someone who would use slang or swear words? Or again, you know, that formal versus informal voice. I'll tell you a quick funny little story. My husband is from Texas. And when we first started dating, you know, those of you who have ever met anyone from the Deep South, especially from Texas, know that it's famous for these very colorful sort of colloquialisms. And we were first dating, we were talking about something, and he was telling me a story. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the story, he makes this comment about a truck going tits up. And I stopped him. I said, what? What did you say? Well, the truck went tits up right there on the side of the highway. Now, if you think about it for a minute, you get the visual, you can understand what that means, right? The truck died, okay, much like a body of a woman may be lying flat on her back, right? So it's a little crass, but Texans are famous for saying things like that. People from other parts of the country or other parts of the world may similarly have regional dialects, turns of phrase, habits, ways of speaking. Adding in these kinds of details really helps to make your dialogue sound natural and authentic, right? You also want to think about whether or not the various voices in your book are different. So again, each character has a different background and personality. Just like in real life, where everyone has his or her own voice, you want your characters to sound different from one another. Another way to deal with unnatural dialogue and voice in your manuscript is to pay attention to attributives. So things like he said, she said, he shouted, she laughed, etc. Now the first question when looking at this element is, are they really necessary? It's a pretty common habit, especially among new writers, to overuse dialogue tags. You don't need an attributive after every line of dialogue, especially if there's a conversation that's going on for several lines and you can make it clear otherwise who's speaking, right? So this is that talking heads situation that people talk about sometimes. When you have two characters speaking to one another, once you've established which person speaks first and which person speaks second, that rhythm is going to continue back and forth, back and forth. Every single line does not have to say, Tony said, Jane said, Tony said, Jane said, right? Eliminate them if you don't actually need them for clarity. You also want to try and convey emotion through other approaches than through attributives. So using things like punctuation, word choice, and even action that might be surrounding your dialogue are going to be stronger ways to convey emotion than relying on adverb attributives. For example, he shouted angrily. Because most of the time, you can show that a character is angry in a much more interesting way through showing rather than telling. You know, think for a moment, what other ways can you convey that a character is angry other than saying he shouted angrily? Revision casualties are another extremely common problem. So when you cut, you've spent a lot of time revising a draft, especially if you've been making huge changes and moving scenes around and adding things in and taking things back out, sometimes you forget to clean up. Sometimes there's these little lingering loose ends and bits. We want to close those ends up. We want to clean that up and catch all those little things that our eyes tend to skim over because we know what's supposed to be on the page. But they're going to catch a reader up short. They're going to be major speed bumps, and they're going to make your draft look very unprofessional. So you want to look for things like loose ends, plot points or subpoints, plot points or subplots, or explanations that really don't go anywhere, right? So for example, maybe you were making a point, but then you decided to cut that section. Well, if you forgot a paragraph or an exercise that goes along with that point or that relied on that point, okay, then it's going to be confusing. You might still have that paragraph or that exercise, but you deleted all the other stuff around it, right? You want to look for sentence beginnings, ends, and random words that might seem stuck in or that don't make sense. And again, this is something you're going to catch a lot more easily if you read out loud or have someone reading out loud to you, or you record yourself and listen to the recording. You're going to find those weird little bits a lot more easily, because this is, again, something your eye tends to skim over when you're reading material that you've read over and over and over again already. You want to look for floating punctuation, like a period where there shouldn't be one, or quotation marks where there's no dialogue, right? Little things that got left over because you deleted maybe some dialogue and forgot a piece of punctuation. And you want to check your chronology, right? Do the math. And what this means is anytime there's some kind of numerical situation involved in your book, you want to make sure the numbers add up properly. So for example, if your story takes place in 1948, you want to make sure that your character isn't driving a 52 Chevy, right? Not possible. If you have two people in your memoir that are 3 years apart in age, make sure their ages are 30 and 33, not 30 and 34. Likewise with anecdotes, right? I worked on a book with a Navy SEAL officer who told a lot of wartime stories about his various deployments and missions. And after a while, we started to notice that occasionally these stories sort of referenced each other and that the timing didn't quite add up in terms of where he was when and how much time had elapsed in between different deployments and different missions. So by going through and creating a kind of timeline, we were able to identify where those problems were and then correct them. Other types of revision casualties can include characters who might be introduced but then are never seen again, or conversely, characters who just appear suddenly without an introduction, right? Now again, this is equally true for people who are in anecdotes in a nonfiction book as opposed to a novel or a memoir. So this can happen when you merge characters. Sometimes you realize you just have too many secondary characters and you're going to take a couple of them and make them into one person. Well, maybe you've just forgotten to delete a couple of the names, right, of those other characters, or scenes where those other characters still appear. Similarly, like I said in the anecdotes, maybe you took out an anecdote, but you reference a person very briefly in another chapter, and you say, just like with so-and-so's experience in chapter 3, blah, 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 but you've already taken it out of chapter 3. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about with this. You want to look for sudden name changes or incongruent descriptions. This is sort of a related issue. You want to watch that you don't change hair or eye color, for instance. I once had a client who was writing a romance novel where the heroine of the novel, changed her hair color 3 different times throughout the course of the book. And it wasn't because she dyed it. It was just because the author kept changing her mind about, what exactly she wanted her protagonist to look like. So you want to keep track of those kinds of details and make sure that they're consistent all the way throughout your book. You also want to make sure you're paying close attention to how the characters or people in your book are moving in, around, and out of scenes. Okay, I call this moving through time and space. You don't want to have someone, for example, enter the living room and sit on the sofa, and then the next thing we know, they're standing in front of the refrigerator getting a beer, but we haven't seen them move from the living room to the kitchen or from the sofa to the refrigerator, right? So movement through time and space. Make sure everything is logical. Make sure that everything is clear. Make sure everything that has to do with the movement of the characters or, not always characters. It could be a vehicle or an animal or something else, but any kind of movement in your book should take place in a logical sense, spatially and time-wise, the elapsation of time. In a nonfiction book, you may have cut chapters, exercises, anecdotes, or even whole sections devoted to a particular point. So again, make sure anything that references those cut sections comes out too. I can say with virtual certainty that everyone listening to this course has heard at one time or another the old writing advice that you should show and not tell. Right? Too much telling and not enough showing is an extremely common problem. But here's the thing. You need some telling, right? You need some exposition. There's no such thing as a book that has no telling, no exposition whatsoever. So really, when we say show and don't tell, it's because most people err on the side of telling too much and not showing enough. What you're really aiming for is a little bit more of a balance between the two, probably about 50-50 of each, honestly, throughout. So what do we really mean by showing more than telling, and how do you decide where you should be doing it and where you shouldn't? First and foremost, you want to be descriptive. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, show us emotion with body language, action, and dialogue rather than telling us what those emotions at work are. So instead of she was angry, show us that she was angry. How would you show the reader that someone was angry? Maybe she crosses her arms and presses her lips together. Maybe she stomps on the ground. Maybe she bangs a hand on the table. Maybe her face turns red, right? There's lots of tells that can convey emotion in a much more interesting way. You can also really amp up the showing versus telling in your draft by avoiding unspecific and boring words. So I'm talking about words that don't really have specific meaning, okay? Beautiful, attractive, elegant, embarrassing, wonderful, powerful, hilarious, interesting, boring, stupid, right? What one person thinks is beautiful, another person may not find it beautiful at all. It might think it's ugly or just dull, right? What exactly does it mean when one character looks at another and thinks, oh, she's so beautiful? What is it that's beautiful? What is it that that character is finding beautiful? Show us, don't tell us. And here's a little tip. You can do a search for the words on this list right here. What I like to do in Microsoft Word is I'll run a search and use the advanced features to highlight the words that I'm looking for. So if you know how to do that, you basically run a search for each word on the list one at a time, highlighting each word that you're searching for, and then save it. And what you'll end up with is all of these words on the list will be highlighted all the way throughout your draft. And then you can take time to go through and just look for the highlighted words and address them and see if there are ways where you can be more descriptive and show a little bit more instead of telling, and really just, up the engagement of each moment in your book. Similarly, you want to look out for ineffective use of nouns and verbs. This is a real line editing level technique that can make a huge difference in your reader's experience. So what I'm talking about here is tightening by analyzing your use of nouns and verbs. Now, if you have a problem with word count, which can often be very challenging for new writers, often overwriting is a problem, this is one way that you can start to reduce that word count, leaving valuable real estate for more important things in your draft, like character development. But also, it just generally makes for more effective, interesting writing when you use more specific descriptive words. So for example, talking about nouns, if you were to replace melting snow with slush, or wide grassy field with meadow, right? The English language is incredibly broad. There's a word for almost everything. So you want to look for those opportunities to use those more specific and descriptive words. Verbs and adverbs, same thing. Replace ran quickly with sprinted, or cried out with exclaimed. All right, these are just examples, but I think you guys get the idea. Repetitive or filler words. Another great way to polish your draft and make your writing stronger. Look for words or phrases that repeat frequently throughout your draft, especially in close proximity, like on the same page, right? Thing is, we all have our favorites that we use over and over in speech. And sometimes those things that we tend to say all the time make their way onto the page when we're writing. So we want to look out for them. You want to make sure you're not saying the same thing, even if it's in different ways, over and over. Okay, this is a related but second problem. We're talking about repetition and redundancy. Now, sometimes this is just left over from editing, right? So it might be one of those revision casualties. But sometimes, especially again with new authors, there's a kind of insecurity. Sometimes when we don't think that we're making ourselves perfectly clear, we sort of rephrase, or rather we repeat ourselves. We sort of say the same thing kind of over and over again because we're not sure that the reader got it. So to correct for that, if you don't think the first time you say something is making things clear, instead of just emphasizing it by saying it over and over again and being redundant and taking up space, just try rephrasing that first statement. Work on making your first statement as clear as possible and you won't have to repeat yourself, right? And last but not least, I want to introduce you to this list of what I call Edith's evil words. And the reason I call it Edith's evil words is I used to belong to a critique group. I ran this critique group. We met every week for 4 years. And it was an incredible experience. There was a wonderful woman in our group named Edith who is famous for circling these types of what we call filler words. So words that most of the time we tend to use just because they're a part of the language and they're very common when we speak. But again, on the written page, they're often unnecessary. They create stumbling blocks, they take up valuable real estate, they slow the pace, they're just not necessary. Words like as, so, but, that, pretty, some, very, has, really, just, was, all seem clearly and obviously. So this is another really great instance of what I mentioned earlier. You can run a search using the advanced features in Microsoft Word and highlight all instances of these words on this particular list and then do a revision pass to deal with them. You're going to find in almost all cases that if you delete these words, it does not affect the sentence or change the meaning or reduce clarity at all. If it does, you should definitely leave it in. There's nothing wrong with these words. They're not grammatically incorrect. They're just filler words. They're often unnecessary. So by removing them, you can tighten and improve your writing and the reading experience overall. We want to look at awkward sentence structure. This is a really important one in terms of stumbling blocks and reading experience as well. You want to make sure every sentence is clear, and if it's not, you want to remedy any awkward phrasing. Reading out loud can really help with this item too. If you're stumbling over something, reading it out loud, your reader is likely going to as well, right? And here's a tip. Just because your grammar is correct doesn't mean it's effective. Okay, something can technically be correct and still be awkward, okay, or even a little bit unclear. And the bottom line is making your reader to work harder to understand what you're saying does not make you sound more literary or intellectual, right? This is something I see often in early drafts. It's something we call faux literary voice, or when someone says the language sounds affected, right? This is what they're talking about. Making things more complicated, making the on-the-page line-level sentences more difficult to read and understand does not make it a literary work. That's not the defining feature. It doesn't make you sound smarter. It just makes you annoying to your readers. And you never want to annoy your readers because they're going to put that book down in a heartbeat. And that is the last thing that we want. Passive voice and weak sentences. Passive voice is another one of those things that I'm sure many of you have heard about as far as a giant writing no-no. Going all the way back to high school and grade school, and certainly more recently in creative writing endeavors. You've probably been told many, many times in many different ways that you never want to have passive voice. You want to avoid passive voice. So I want to make sure that you're really clear on what passive voice actually is. Passive voice, a passive construction, occurs when you make the object of an action into the subject of a sentence. So that is, whoever or whatever is performing the action is not the grammatical subject of the sentence. When that happens, you have a passive construction. You have passive voice. So here's an example. Why was the road crossed by the chicken? That is the passive version of why did the chicken cross the road? You see how much stronger that sounds? Why was the road crossed by the chicken? Why did the chicken cross the road? It's a subtle difference, but active voice flows more smoothly. It also doesn't catch people in the brain. Sometimes why was the road crossed by the chicken? It takes your brain, maybe it's just a half a second in real time, but those neurons are firing trying to figure out, wait, is the road doing the action? Is the road crossing? No, the road's not crossing. Oh, it's the chicken that's crossing the road. But you have to get to the end of the sentence before your brain can figure that out, right? So it can be awkward. It can be a stumbling block. It can jolt your reader out of the work. Good sentence structure is subject, verb, object. Okay? Subject, verb, object. Just some real basic grammar there for you. Now, how do we spot this kind of thing? So here's another example of passive. What is passive voice? Passive, it's usually passive if it's followed by a past participle. Okay, so that can be one clue. Here's an example. The war had been won by our army in January. Okay, won in this example is the past participle. The active version of that same sentence would be, our army won the war in January. It's clearer, it's shorter. A quick and dirty way to catch this sort of thing is to circle and analyze what we call to be verbs. Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, and been. If you go through and you circle, or using the trick I described earlier, highlight all instances of these words and then revisit them, it's going to help you catch a lot of instances of passive voice. It's also going to help you catch phrasings that aren't technically passive voice, but are still considered weak sentence construction. So here's another example. Mary was insulted by his lack of attention. Technically, strictly speaking, it doesn't violate good sentence structure, right? But a better way to write that that's less passive and tighter and more active, his lack of attention insulted Mary. Okay, because we've gotten rid of the was in that instance. The was is the to be verb. It's just generally considered more effective. It improves the pace. It maintains clarity. Okay, now I just want to make sure I'm being clear though, not all to be verbs indicate passive voice. So don't twist yourself into a pretzel trying to avoid them. Just look for opportunities where they appear and see, is there a stronger, clearer, tighter way that I can rephrase this sentence? Oh, cliches. We all use cliches. Cliches show up everywhere. But in writing, when you use cliches, it's considered shorthand. It's considered lazy, right? It is considered the mark of an amateur or lazy writer, someone who doesn't know better. So what are they really? At the most basic level, a cliche is an overused descriptor or phrase. They're usually metaphors, not always, but often. So for example, eyes of a hawk, it's hot as hell, taking the bull by the horns, right? Those are metaphor types of cliches that are seriously overused, and they tend to make people cringe. They don't mean anything, okay? They're shorthand. They convey something. So you're having a conversation, you say, oh, it was hot as hell. You're talking to somebody, they understand that you mean it was really, really hot, right? But this is another example where being specific and descriptive is always the better route. Ultimately, hot as hell is not specific. It's not descriptive. How hot exactly was it? Okay, there are better ways to show that than to shoot off this cliche. Okay, now, I do want to give a caveat here. Sometimes you use a cliche deliberately. If you have a character, going back to unnatural dialogue and voice, right? If you have a character who tends to speak using a lot of cliches, then by all means, use those cliches, but make sure you're using them deliberately. Make sure that they're not appearing in your manuscript because you just didn't take the time to think of a better way to say something, right? Now, you want to be very wary of using also situations and characters that are cliches. So for example, classic, cops eating donuts when they're supposed to be working. Or if there's a villain, a bad guy in your story, you know, dressing that bad guy in black and putting a scar on his face. Total cliches. We've seen those things a million times. So again, if you use them deliberately, for example, in a humorous story, you know, where your villain is totally cliche, stereotypical, and you're poking fun at that, or that has a particular role in your story because he's a cliche or she's a cliche, that's fine. That's something you're doing deliberately. But you want to avoid being lazy. You don't want to just rely on those cliches. Okay, you want your story to feel more real, more authentic. With nonfiction, I want to call out a specific challenge here. Be wary of reducing your target readers to cliches, okay, in terms of how you think about your content. It's very tempting to make assumptions that can veer into feeling like a judgment. You want readers to feel like you get them and get their challenges, not that you're pandering because you're stereotyping a community that you don't really know or care about. Empty adverbs are another one of those parts of speech that show up very often when we're just having casual conversation, but technically they're redundant, and that really stands out when you see them on the page. They're often used for emphasis, but because they're redundant, they tend to have the opposite effect. So what am I talking about in terms of empty adverbs? I've got a list for you right here. Actually, totally, absolutely, completely. I'm not going to go through the whole list. You can see it there on your screen. You know, and this is what I mean when I say that they're used for emphasis, but technically redundant. Your presence at the meeting is absolutely essential. Think about that for a minute. Something is either essential or it's not, right? It can't be partly essential or sort of essential. So using the word absolutely essential really doesn't add anything to the meaning of the sentence. It's just wordy and redundant. Similarly, he was totally miserable without her. I mean, as opposed to what? Partly miserable? Only a little miserable? Right? Not necessary. So once again, you can run an advanced search to highlight and deal with this list of empty adverbs. Look for opportunities to delete it. Usually you can just strike it right out. Your presence at the meeting is essential. It means exactly the same thing as your presence at the meeting is absolutely essential. Saying he was miserable without her means exactly the same thing as he was totally miserable without her. Monotonous rhythm. This one always takes me back to kindergarten and first grade because I think about these kinds of exercises. I'm going to show you what I mean. In a written work, think about yourself as you read something, right? We all tend to sort of read out loud in our heads, and we sort of hear in our heads whatever it is we're seeing on the page. So rhythm can become a really important element. When you have too many sentences with the same rhythm in close proximity, it creates monotony. Monotony means your reader stops paying attention. If you've ever read a page in a book and you realize all of a sudden that you're like 3 paragraphs down and you have no idea what you just read, you just kind of fell right out of it and stopped paying attention, oftentimes that problem is caused by a monotonous rhythm. Okay, so here's a trick to help you catch this problem. If you clap the rhythm of each sentence, this is where that kindergarten first grade flashback comes in. If you clap the rhythm of each sentence to hear which ones sound the same, you can listen for pauses in the same sequence or a similar number of beats per sentence part. Okay? Let's see if you can hear me clapping. Jane hated school but liked her friends. She got dressed, then went outside. She met her friends and walked to school. See how the rhythm is the same? Right? This is also a good example of what I call the ABC XYZ pattern. I have found it to be one of the most common patterns of repetitive rhythm. So if you use this clapping trick and you hear the rhythm of your sentences, the beat, and you look for that ABC XYZ pattern, which is right here, Jane hated school but liked her friends. If you rephrase, use punctuation and different word choices to eliminate that monotonous rhythm, it's going to help keep your reader engaged. Accidental word swaps and misspellings. These are really tricky. These are one of those things that you definitely cannot rely on technology to help you with. That's because spell check just won't catch these errors. An accidental word swap or a misspelling is when you're using a real word, you're just using the wrong one in the wrong place. Okay, so that means you really have to know the rules of these kinds of words yourself. And that handout that I have for you on resources includes some of my very favorite basic grammar resources, which I very much would encourage you to check out. That'll help you if you struggle with any of these common word swaps. For example, there, and there, or it's and its, your and your, than and then, right? All of these are correct words, real words that spell check is going to recognize as being good. Now, there are some more advanced tools that will recognize a word in context and suggest that it might be the wrong word or not the word that you wanted to use. And again, the handout includes a couple of my favorites and suggestions on some of those that you can try. But ultimately, getting really clear on when you're supposed to use each of these types of words is going to be your best bet. So to sum up, I want to go through a couple more tips for helping you spot these errors. Some of them I've mentioned already, some of them I haven't. First and foremost, I always encourage people to print a manuscript out. There's been a lot of research showing that when we read something on a screen, it actually activates different parts of our brain than when we read something on a printed page. For example, there's been research showing that we retain information less easily when we read an ebook versus when we read a printed book, okay? So by printing your draft out, even if you revised it on your screen, you will undoubtedly catch things that you didn't see before. And while you're at it, you print that out, go ahead and read it out loud. Read it out loud and just listen to yourself. Record yourself reading it out loud and then play it back so you can just passively listen. Or even better, if you can get someone else to read it out loud to you, the entire draft, but especially actual spoken bits like dialogue, that's going to help you catch a lot of these things we've talked about, like the awkward rhythm, the revision casualties, the unnatural dialogue. Many things can be caught by reading things out loud, which again activates a different part of your brain as well. An unusual trick that can work for a lot of people, reading backwards. Okay, I don't mean reading out loud backwards. We're not spinning a record backwards and trying to summon Satan. I'm not talking about that kind of thing. I'm just saying, take a page and maybe start at the end of each sentence and read backwards, or start at the bottom of the page, okay? And literally look at each word moving from right to left, from the bottom of the page back to the top of the page. That's going to help you catch things that your brain might otherwise skip over. Remember, I've said a couple of times that your brains are actually designed to understand things in context. That's why it's so easy to miss certain kinds of errors. When you know what's supposed to be on the page, when you know what it was you were trying to say, you might read an email over 5 times and never catch a typo, or never catch that you've used the wrong word, or that even that you've said the wrong thing. You may have said, like, I want to have lunch on Monday, and you actually wrote Sunday. You could read that 3 times and not even realize that that's what you did, because your brain is filling in the blanks. Reading backwards forces your brain to work differently. It forces you to look at each word and punctuation mark in isolation. So you're going to catch things like floating punctuation, words that might be the incorrect word, a real word in an incorrect place, etc. A really great piece of advice is give it time. Okay, having fresh eyes is one of the most important keys to really polishing a manuscript draft. So if you've just typed the end, don't start your revision process right away. Put your draft away for a week. Work on something else, or give yourself a break. Don't work on anything. Read a great book instead, right? Give it time, and then when it's time to come back to your draft after you've done all of these other things, get another opinion, okay? Here's the thing, you guys. It is completely impossible, biologically, psychologically, however you want to phrase it, it is impossible to be completely objective about your own work because you are the creator. Okay, the brain plays tricks on us. There's also emotional investment. There's also ego. There's lots of things that get in the way of us being completely objective about our own work. Even professionals, okay, even me. I've been in this business almost 20 years. I'm also a writer. I've collaborated on books. I write blog posts. I write articles. I've written books. Even I have worked with professional editors, and they will always find things, and not just typos. I mean important things, you know, like topics that I didn't explain fully, things I said I was going to explain and then didn't, right? It's impossible to be completely objective about your own work. So you, at some point, you want to get at least one other person, at least, who can really be critical to read your work. And I want to be clear here. I'm not talking about your mother, not your husband, not your kid, not anyone who's legally obligated to be nice to you. Okay, when I say objective, I am not including people who are legally obligated to be nice to you. Okay, I mean, that's the joke, right? A critical reader. Ideally, your reader should be a writer, or at least someone who is a very critical reader and experienced with identifying weaknesses and explaining how to improve them. Okay, the reason that I really prefer when authors get critical readers who are also writers, such as in a critique group, as I mentioned earlier, I led and was a member of a critique group for many, many years. I'm a big fan of critique groups. I think they're extremely useful. One of the reasons it's better to get a critical read from another writer is that they're going to pay more attention to the technique and structure. Okay, they're going to notice what is and isn't working in ways that your average reader just won't. Because remember, at the end of the day, the agent or editor that you're submitting to, or the critic who will hopefully review your book, or the judges for the contest that you're going to submit your self-published book to, these people are not your average reader. They have much more critical eyes. So you want similarly critical eyes to help you revise before submitting. If you want to give your book the very best chance it has of getting out there in the marketplace, getting discovered, getting read, getting enjoyed, and most of all, getting talked about, right? We all want readers to love our books and leave awesome reviews and then tell all their friends about it so that we can get more and more readers and build our audience for every subsequent book you publish. And these are some tips that hopefully will help you to do exactly that. So that's all I have for you guys. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and found it useful. And if you get to that point of needing another opinion and you would like to explore the possibility of working with a professional editor, I run an excellent and deeply experienced team of industry professionals providing editorial services at various levels. We also work on things like publishing and marketing strategy. So if we can be of help to you, please visit us at thewritersally.com. Or you can check me out a little bit more as an author at allimashadi.com.